Welcome to week 6, where we're going to talk about relationship management. This is our final domain, and we're going to split this over 2 weeks. So this week and next week, because this one has 7 skills. So it's a lot more, there's a lot more meat to it, a lot more to do with it, a lot more to think through with it. So we'll just start with a couple skills today and then finish up the rest next week, one our time together, and that's about it. Last time, we explored kind of how communication serves as the bridge between social awareness and relationship management. And we focused on listening and basically how tuning into other people helps us recognize, what they might be thinking, what they might be feeling. And so today I want to build on that by turning real quick, just briefly before we get into relationship management, talking about nonverbal and verbal communication. Because once we've listened, the next questions become, well, how do we respond? How do we express ourselves in ways that show empathy or, an understanding? So I want to start with nonverbal because we left off with listening, and listening as communication, right, helps us kind of tune into other people's thoughts, tune into what they're feeling, their experiences. But it's not just about the words we're hearing, right? We're listening, and while we're listening, we're also watching what people are doing, and their expressions and their posture and their tone of voice. I don't know if Casey was, you know, really how she spoke about her situation, but sometimes people are really fully embodied in it with a lot of passion, right? Or maybe they're meeker, but all of that's telling us something about their emotional experience with it. So all of these nonverbal cues often can carry more emotional meaning than the actual words the person's using. And we kind of saw that when we looked back at self-management, that sometimes self-management, especially low self-management, means we're protruding anger and things without the awareness of the words on how to describe it, because our self-awareness is low, right? But we're feeling and we're reacting, we're wearing it on our sleeve, we're showing all these nonverbal cues. We don't have the language for it yet. So this is helpful when it comes to listening to people, to listen to watch for nonverbal cues. And this is what's really important. So this awareness works both ways. We're not only reading other people's nonverbal signals so that we can understand them, right? But we're also communicating through the signals that we're giving off, right? So we're talking about listening here still, but we're also now talking about how you communicate. So when we think about nonverbal cues, obviously some of the main ones we notice are facial expressions, gestures, posture, and tone of voice. And an emotionally intelligent communicator pays attention to these cues like in both directions, right? So reading them in others and being intentional about the ones they're sending out. And research actually shows that being sensitive to nonverbal communication is a huge part of social awareness of that last domain, obviously, because empathy was a huge component of it, right? And then also um, uh, organizational awareness, so reading cultures, right? So it's going to help you interpret emotions more accurately and respond in ways that fit the situation. Now, even though you didn't take a nonverbal like communication assessment, you did get to take some communication styles assessments, if you remember just a couple weeks ago. And those can actually give you insight into how you might show up non-verbally to others. So right now we're not talking about your ability to read people, but how you what kind of nonverbal cues you tend are probably like innate to you. So for example, a couple weeks ago, you got to take the Colors Preferred Communication Styles assessment. And I don't know that I love or don't like that assessment. It was just something that was open access and easy to use. So it was a great starting place to think about communication styles, but there's obviously a ton of communication style theories out there. But using that one, because many of you took that, there were 4 communication styles, right? We had driver, analyzer, influence, and feeler. Let's just for a quick second talk about how those might show up, how someone with that communication style, what their communication style might be non-verbally. So people with a driver style often use really steady eye contact and a confident posture. People who are feelers usually show softer expressions and more open gestures and have like a softer toned voice, right? Sometimes you can talk to someone and be like, oh, you're very warm. You sound very warm and friendly, right? We're hearing that in tone. Analyzers tend to be more reserved, so they're keeping their gestures very controlled and their expressions very, very subtle. And then the influencers tend to show up with lots of energy in their nonverbal communication. So animated facial expressions and gestures, very lively and dynamic tone of voice. And this matches kind of some of the things we know about personality theory, right? But when we talk about your communication style, it's not just the words you're using and how you're talking to people, it's also how you're showing up physically in those conversations. Um, if you're curious, there are even a couple online quizzes you can take to show how well you read facial expressions. So I guess just circling back to how we're understanding and reading nonverbal cues in others. One is from Paul Ekman. We've talked about that name in our time together several times. So he's the big name in facial expression research. Another is from ProProfs, and both of these give you like quick feedback on how accurately you're picking up on emotional signals, these nonverbal cues. And I'll make sure you get those links. I think I already put one in our course shell, but I'll send them out again. And taking assessments like this can actually help you improve your ability to read nonverbal cues. So if you're someone who struggles with understanding, your wife says, "I'm not angry," but to someone like me, I'm like, it's clear she's angry at you, right? So if you're not reading the nonverbal aspect, you can train the skill into you to understand these things. So now let's circle back to the way you communicate with nonverbal communication. So just some tips on or strategies on how you can improve your nonverbal communication or become more aware of what it is you're doing, right? So let's just go for the low-hanging fruit here. If you were an analyzer communication style, right? You're more reserved, your gestures are very controlled. So when you're talking to someone who's very lively and you're very reserved, they're thinking maybe you're not listening or maybe you're judging them. We can take anybody's communication style and twist it to be like, you don't care. So one of the first things you can do, though, to make sure you're showing up in a nonverbal way is observe yourself. So notice how your body, how your body language shifts when you're relaxed versus when you're stressed, and what message that might send to others. The next thing you can do is try mirroring people. A lot of R's, and the American R is so hard. So that means subtly matching someone else's posture or tone. Emotionally intelligent people do this when they talk to their bosses, when they talk to their kids, when they talk to their colleagues, right? You are reading the room and the organizational structure, and you're meeting people where they're at, right? So, but you can match their posture or tone, and that creates like a sense of connection and rapport. And we do this in linguistics all the time. We call it, well, it's the theory of accommodation, right? So if you are with somebody, I talk very fast, I talk kind of at a high pitch. If I'm with someone who talks slower and more mellow, I think I do this with Dr. Klipchuk. So I will slow down myself to kind of, I'm not thinking, well, let me slow down my speech so we have more camaraderie. It's not like that, but there's just an innate, instinct in humans to kind of accommodate and, meet someone where they're, become something that's like more unified, right? When we're interacting with each other. So mirroring people, being intentional about that. And finally, the other thing was to be aware of cultural differences. So we talked about that last week with social awareness, just the idea that there's different cultural ways of expressions, right? So a gesture or expression, that feels warm and friendly in one culture might not mean that in a completely different culture. So just some ways to think through how we can improve how we're showing up for something, right? And I want to leave you with this reminder before we move on to verbal, because we're talking about nonverbal, right? Is that emotionally intelligent communicators don't just focus on what they say, but how they say it, right? So your tone, your pace, your energy, these all shape that emotional message that we send. And I will say, this morning, I was frustrated over something, and my daughter asked me a question that was unrelated, and I responded with, what instead of what? And I couldn't get out like just a calm what, because I could tell inside I was emotionally overburdened. There's a whole like TikTok series on that too, like the overstimulated parent trying to like respond to the child without sounding stressed out. But yeah, so how we say it has a lot of impact on the people around us. Moving on to verbal. So we got a couple slides here talking about verbal communication, and we're going to talk about our communication styles. So listening is a foundation to strong communication, but we're going to shift to speaking. Um, One of the things to do is before you even open your mouth is it helps to pause, right? Because emotionally intelligent communication doesn't actually begin with what you say. It kind of begins with what you feel. So when you're aware of your own emotions, you're more likely, before you speak, you're in touch with, you have that high self-awareness. You're more likely to choose your words more intentionally, manage your tone, and then also express yourself in a way that connects with people instead of creates conflict. And this is especially important. Obviously, I'm building scenarios in my head where these are difficult conversations. So it's worth doing emotional check ins before difficult conversations, asking yourself, what am I feeling right now? What do I really need to communicate clearly? So, touching back on our very first domain, self awareness to self management, all the way up to relationship management. The whole thing is cyclical, it's all connected. All four domains play a role within each other. So obviously verbal communication is the main way we share our thoughts and our emotions. And it kind of shows up in three main ways. So we have clarity. Um, you know what you want to say and you say it clearly. Empathy, you shape your message with other people's feelings in mind. And then adaptability, you're able to adjust your tone and the content to match that emotional context. So that's what emotional intelligent communication looks like. And the research shows that people who adapt their language and tone based on emotional cues are more likely to build that trust and reduce conflict. That seems kind of like a no brainer, but if you need to know, there's a 2013 article and probably many more that actually support that prove it to you, right? So it's fact, or at least it's not been disproven. Um, how do we actually get better at verbal communication? There's quite a few things, we can do. I'll just kind of rattle off. I think I put them on, I used to put a couple of them on the slide, but obviously use I statements. Instead of saying you never listen to me, you might say I felt overlooked in that meeting, right? um Practice emotional labeling, try naming what you or others might be feeling. You sound frustrated, or I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. Tailor your message. If someone seems defensive, start with reassurance instead of correction, right? And then bring in that adaptability skill of adjusting your tone. Obviously, a big one's going to be managing your own emotions first. So, emotional regulation is what's going to keep your message clear and um, prevent your tone from escalating. Um, One of the thing you can do, which it sounds again very elementary, is to actually practice and reflect. So, a great exercise is to record yourself in mock conversations, then go back and listen for that tone, listen for your emotional energy, listen to whether or not you were clear. Um, so, sorry, I was thinking of something Dr. Klipchak Carrie told me about Meisner acting before. But if any of you have ever had those conversations, like, you're painting, I'll be upstairs just painting a bedroom. That's my task for the day. And the whole time I'm painting, I'm having a fight with someone from work and we're fighting it out in my head. Right. And usually those role play fights in my head, they're not emotionally intelligent. They're like, I'm throwing zingers and I'm insulting the person. But this is actually working against some of the practice that I'm talking about here, which is practice emotionally intelligent conversations. That's what I mean by that. When you're having that fake fight with someone in your head while you're doing, dishes or laundry, practice emotional intelligent conversations. So, and verbal communication is really that meeting point between self-awareness and social awareness. So we could have moved this up in our time together. Um, it's really where what's going on inside of you connects with the people around us. And that sets the stage for relationship management, which is what we're going to talk about, which is building trust, handling conflict, influencing others, and building teams and units. Jumping into communication styles. Okay, so you had the chance to take 2 communication style assessments, and those links are still available to you. They really shape how we express ourselves and how we connect with others. So it's worth exploring. You had the opportunity to take 2 assessments. I'm going to go over them real quick and tie them into communication. There was the colors preferred communication styles, and then just the generic communication styles assessment. If you remember your responses or your your results. You can share it in the chat with each other. But together, they're really going to give you insight in like your natural tendencies and how others might experience you as a communicator. So just to kind of explain how each of these styles shows up in communication. If you were a driver, your strength is that you're very decisive and you're direct and you're goal oriented. A challenge for you with communication is that that directness might come across as impatient or blunt, which obviously risks creating more conflict and more resistance, right? So a tip for drivers would be to practice softening your tone, showing empathy to strengthen rapport. So not skipping the understanding stage. This is taking you back to that reflect, reframe, validate framework we looked with earlier. If you're a feeler, you're very warm, you're very compassionate, you're naturally very in tune to people's emotions. The challenge you might find is that you take criticism very personally and that you avoid confrontation. So, a tip for you with your communication style would be to work on your assertiveness, learning how to express your needs clearly and confidently in tough situations. If you were an analytical, very detailed focused, and you're very careful and you're very accurate, you make sure you're very precise in what you're saying, right? The challenge for you is that you might get really stuck in the facts and hold back yourself emotionally, which can keep communication from feeling personal, right? Someone feels like they're talking to a robot, someone who's not listening. These are probably people who like to fix things as opposed to just coming in with that emotional support. So a growth tip for you might be to practice sharing your feelings, recognizing when emotional expression builds connection, right? Which is not maybe where your home base is, but it does for other people. If you were an influencer, you're outgoing and you're persuasive and you're enthusiastic, and you're going to see how each of these styles actually fits really well in this domain. So they're all really great styles. So influencers, outgoing, charismatic. The challenge you may have sometimes with communication would be struggling with the follow through or like forgetting to fully listen. So you need to, for someone like you, might have to practice more actively or intentionally the active listening, and also patience. So balancing your desire to talk with the hearing, with the time to hear. I had another point I was going to make. I think it's on a different slide, so I'll get to my moment in a second. Second style, the second quiz you took, because I really like these assessments. I just want to make sure we're covering them in the context of the class. But you took a communication styles assessment that had a whole different, set of skills. So it was innovator, associator, systemizer, I guess, and energizer or energized. I don't even know how these words ended. It was something like that. So if you're an innovator, you probably found some correlation between this assessment and the other, but I don't know which one you took, so we're going to cover them both. Innovators are like big picture thinkers, very creative, naturally inspire people because they're very creative. The challenge you probably have with communication is that you're going to skip details or bounce between topics, and that's going to confuse people that are following you, right? Or that you might be influencing. So a good strategy for you with communication is to ground your ideas with examples, taking time to stop and explain your vision, and then check in frequently to make sure people are keeping track with you or, caught up with what you're saying. Our associators are people who are very, I liken them to the feelers on the last assessment. They love connecting with people. They value relationships, typically very empathetic and supportive and compassionate, good at reading emotions. Challenges, they're probably going to avoid conflict or struggle to be direct. We saw this with the feeler domain in the last assessment. And because you might avoid being direct, your messages are unclear, right? So we're going to focus, a tip for you is like focus on clarity, focus on being assertive, and focus on the clarity of your message so your meekness doesn't muddle what you actually need to communicate. Our systemizers, logical, organized, and structured. Again, this is like our analyticals in the last assessment. You like clarity and you like facts. And that challenge can come across as, again, rigid or kind of unemotional. Makes it hard to connect to emotionally, right? If that's the goal. Obviously, not every work conversation needs to be emotional. right? But we have emotional intelligence playing a role the whole way through. So practice again expressing feelings, tuning into others' emotional cues. Our energizers are just like our influencers, enthusiastic, dynamic people. Um, a different take on it from this assessment, though, is that your speed and excitement may actually overwhelm people or cause them to miss details, right? So slowing down, because one theme from this and the influencers, these people probably talk a lot, right? Probably great storytellers, very charming. Slowing down to give space for other people to contribute and process the information be useful. So, um, whatever style assessment you're taking, and obviously personality plays a big role in here. You're probably making connections between these assessments and actually your personality results, because there's a lot of parallels between them. I could name Clifton strengths that explain these things too. But obviously, having the language through a shared assessment like this is going to help you adapt your communication, um, so that you're not just speaking from your own style, but also connecting with the style of the person you're talking to. So you're looking at this as, oh yeah, I'm a innovator. That's what I do. Maybe you're married to an energizer, or maybe you're married to a feeler, an associator, right? So thinking about how the other styles work and other people, very beneficial to you. Obviously, assessments are going to highlight blind spots that might lead to miscommunication and misunderstanding and emotional distancing. And third, I think it really helps you use your natural strengths more intentionally. So remember, back in self-awareness, one of the core skills there was knowing your strengths, knowing your limitations, but knowing your strengths, and leaning into those to capitalize on aspects of emotional intelligence that you're really skilled at. So here's my one last reminder: the style you use, the communication style you use, is often the one you prefer to receive as well. So you have to be very mindful of that. Um, if you're a feeler and you're talking to an a systemizer, right? You're naturally wanting them to be a feeler back to you, right? So we need to, I guess, be mindful that um, you know, you're not talking to someone who's the communicate same communication style as you. You can already automatically bring a level of emotional understanding to the conversation if you value the communication style of the other person, even if it doesn't match yours. Digital communication. I think what's important to also think about how communication changes when we're not face to face. So we have emails and we have text messages, we have video calls, just like this one. And there's a lot of nonverbal cues that we would normally rely on that, like, we can't really rely on, or they're harder to read when we're online like this, or when it's in writing, right? So it's an email message. And so we have to work a little harder to make sure our messages land the way we intend. So a few things to keep in mind. You do often need to read between the lines. So you've got to look for context clues in what's written or in what's not written. And that can be a really blurry, a really big gray area, because you might take your very quick email from your boss as offensive because it was very brief, and they're just busy and they're just getting it out, right? With caution, read between the lines. You need to work extra hard in written communication, obviously, to be clear and clarify your meaning, and not assume it's understood correctly. You have to be thoughtful about tone, which is often what comes across in terms of like punctuation, also the timing of when you send things, because even small things like all caps, right? Too many exclamation points or delaying a response that can send unintended messages. So the bottom line is that emotional intelligent communication, you have to be just as intentional online as you are in person. Pause before hitting send, reread your message for tone. Um, and it's really hard. You need to choose clarity and empathy over speed, because right now, email's efficient, right? But now it serves a whole nother social role. We are going to go into relationship management now. I've done a long build up. We're like 40 minutes in and we haven't gotten there. It is our fourth and final domain. And another way that it's called, we're calling it relationship management, but Goleman also called this domain social skills, which I think is appropriately named. So this is about using Emotional intelligence to build stronger relationships. And we define this as the ability to inspire, influence, and develop others while managing conflict. It involves clear communication, which we've talked about now, and effectively handling conflict, teamwork, and collaboration. As you can imagine, this domain has a lot of skills. Relationship management, the first thing you're probably thinking is like having healthy friendships or healthy, but there's so much more than to just having friendships with peers and colleagues and your family and your children. There's a lot of skills involved to it. So, what we're going to do today is we're just going to look at the first three, time allowing. And then we'll look at the last four in our next time together. So, we've got influence, developing others, conflict management, inspirational leadership, change catalyst, building bonds, collaboration, and teamwork. These skills are all informed by social awareness and self-management, our first two domains. So you can't manage relationships effectively if you don't understand others with empathy, right? With social awareness. Nor can you do so without managing your own impulses or your own stresses, right? So that takes us back to self-management. Again, to reiterate, in case you missed it in the last couple videos, or last times together, that these all relate to each other. They're all building blocks up to this domain right here. Let's talk about influence as our first skill of relationship management. When we say influence, some people immediately think maybe manipulation or control, and that's not what we mean here, right? Influence is about shaping outcomes in ways that's positive and respectful. So being persuasive, but also being really credible and inspiring. And when you're good at influence, people listen to you. They trust your intentions, right? And they're more likely to, I guess, get on board with your ideas. So what does it take to develop this skill? A few key things. So we've got credibility. Um, you walk your walk, or you walk your talk, I think is more the phrase, and you earn the respect of others. We've got empathy. You understand, what matters to other people and communicate in ways that will connect with their needs. Confidence and clarity. So coming back to that communication stuff of speaking clearly, speaking calmly with the right tone, and then also strategic thinking. So you know when and how and whom to present your ideas to for the best impact. These are the four sub skills of the skill of influence. But what I want you to notice is that these the four things I just mentioned, really rely on good social awareness. Empathy is social awareness. Strategic thinking is organizational awareness under social awareness. This idea of being credible, so being trustworthy, we learned that back in self-management. So notice it's basically saying we have to have the other domains in check to see success here, right? Um, if you want to strengthen your influence, perhaps this isn't something that describes you right. There are some really practical things you can start doing right away. One is practice active listening. We just did an exercise on that a minute ago. Reflect what you hear back to people, and they're going to feel really heard by you. Then they're much more open to hearing from you on what you're doing, what you're working on. Build credibility, so follow through on your commitments, follow through on your promises. Build a good reputation from that. Something that's really probably more practical or easy to grasp is to practice using good storytelling or talking about bringing visions to life with good details. So obviously we know, like when we hear a TED talk, right, we're really inspired by stories that we can see ourselves in or that we feel are really, articulated well. So, don't underestimate a compelling story. And some of us, communication isn't like good storytelling isn't innate to us. I know some people who are really great storytellers and they can tell a story at any moment and the room stops to listen. But the rest of us, it's a skill, right? We have to practice. So, but don't undersell it because it's a huge part of what can make you influential. Finally, be intentional with timing and also context. So, you want to present your ideas when people are ready to receive them and frame them in ways that connect with, their priorities. And I think this kind of, for me, ties back to organizational awareness under social awareness, which was like, know the room, like know the real power structure, read the room, and also know who the real decision makers are and who the key players are. The key thing with influence, I just want to reiterate one more time, is that, it's not about pushing people around or getting your way at all cost. Um, it's using influence all for positive outcomes. Because remember, we're in emotional intelligence. We're in a domain of psychology that's very linked closely to well-being, mental health, positive psychology. So you have to imagine everything here is basically to engender in you a way of positively contributing to society, not manipulating it. Let's talk about the second skill, developing others. So this is really about coaching and mentoring, right? So now you don't have to be a manager or a teacher to practice this. So you don't have to have a formal role to be someone that's developing and investing in other people. Maybe you're a parent, maybe you're just you have friends. The skill is purely about recognizing someone's potential and actively supporting their growth. Um, and to there's quite a few sub skills we'd want to think about in order to be good at this, but obviously patience and presence. So you're making space for other people in your life so that they to learn about them. Listening skills, big one. You feel like that's a theme. Maybe you're picking up on that or hearing that's a big important theme to emotional intelligence. Curiosity, being genuinely curious that in a person, and also being genuinely believing that they have potential, that you and genuinely wanting to help them discover that, right? So if this is an area, of relationship management that you're wanting to get better at from an emotional intelligence standpoint, one thing you can do, and maybe you are in a role where you're trying to develop people, but you just don't feel like you're very good at it. Some practical strategies. Ask open-ended questions. This invites that person to reflect, right? Instead of telling someone what to do, ask questions like, what do you think could work here, right? Or how would you approach this challenge? Um, that's one step. Offer feedback that is specific and encouraging. So focus on behaviors and actions, not traits, right? And celebrate. I think another one is yeah, I put it on. Oh, encourage progress. Celebrate small wins. Recognize progress, right? Even like the tiny steps, and that's going to build, the person you're working with, their confidence, their motivation. Finally, though, also model growth yourself. When you show that you're open to feedback, that you're open to listening, you're adapting, you're going to inspire others to do that. So, developing others. I think a lot of us in this class are actually in professions where this is actually tied to, like, our job, our career objectives, right? So maybe it's a little innate to the way we're thinking. But perhaps we're in roles where we're working with people who are complicated to develop. I guess we all have students too that we're trying to get to nurture into better versions of themselves. But you can also model that, right? If you want that student to take feedback, you've also got to be someone who's looking like someone that you've taken it and you're a product of having been mentored and invested in. Okay, let's take a side road real quick and talk about feedback, because giving feedback is really kind of an extension of developing others, but it actually touches on several different relationship management skills. So, influence for sure, collaboration, teamwork. So some we'll talk about next time. But in this context, what I'm linking it here, and I hope it, is something you recall as we're going through the other skills, is that when it's done well, when feedback's done well, it helps people grow, right? If it's delivered poorly, though, it's going to shut someone down or even damage trust. So we're going to hear a word here, couple words here that we've heard through all of these, but basically the key to giving good feedback is doing so clearly. So with clarity, that's been a big theme. We've talked about influence or communication the last several slides. The word clarity keeps popping up. And doing it with an emotional sensitivity. So you got to be honest, but you also need to be supportive. And that means thinking about how and when you're going to deliver it. Thinking intentionally, is this person in a good emotional space to hear your message? Are you being constructive rather than critical? Another important thing with feedback is obviously balancing facts and feelings. So focusing on what you observed and its impact, not only how it made you feel. So, but here's the thing, some of you are going to be more focused on feelings than facts. Some of you are more inclined to think about facts than feelings. We saw that distinction in the communication styles. So the main thing here is that intentional blending of the two. And I think that's kind of been about the message of most of emotional intelligence is a good balance. Even when we talked about the positive and negative mindset back in self-management, right? Is about balance. So we can have facts and we can have feelings and they can exist as one. Um, when you've shared feedback, though, listen to their response to it. Um, Feedback really, really needs to be a dialogue, not a monologue. So you need to adjust your approach in real time based on what they say in response. Um, there's a couple practical strategies. I mean, I think a lot of these are things I've said, but also thinking through probably a little elementary in some ways. But feedback needs to be supportive, not critical. There might be bad things we need to say, critical things along the way, but we really need to start with what's working well and then share areas for growth. And then also sandwich that by finishing with encouragement, right? So we're taking something negative and we're putting it in the middle of really positive, encouraging things. Be mindful of the person's emotional state, right? If they're having a terrible day, might not be the right time to throw this on them because it's going to be seen as criticism rather than feedback. Um, Listen attentively and adjust too would be the other thing to be a practical strategy. You don't get a lot of chance to practice that. Just kind of get thrown into those situations, but listening well, um, adjusting then our communication style, our nonverbal cues, all of that based on where this person's at, and then encouraging questions, encouraging reflection. So research is showing that emotionally aware feedback fuels performance and builds trust. So I'll get this link to you. This is an article out of Gallup for how effective title of it, how effective feedback fuels performance. And speaking as an employer, from an employer's perspective, or research on employee, giving employees regular helpful, keyword helpful feedback makes them more engaged and actually better at their jobs. Who'd have thought? It makes sense, but it makes sense only under the construct that it's done in an emotional, intelligent way. Gallup has a whole thing they recommend called fast feedback. It's detailed in this article, and it means giving like quick, specific, and useful feedback. So that's all broken down there. But again, it makes people more engaged and more enthusiastic for the work they're doing, as well as more productive. I'll get this link to you, but it offers another practical strategy for the feedback stage. So the important thing with feedback is it's not just about correcting mistakes. It's about helping people grow in ways that feel constructive and motivating. So they leave desiring that growth. And that's why I've wedged it here in the middle, because it kind of sets the stage for a lot of the skills, but especially when we're talking about developing others, this is a huge part of that mentoring or that coaching relationship. All right, 7:30. We're going to talk about conflict management as far as we can get. This hour went really fast. I've got quite a bit here, so we're just going to see what we can get through. Because it in itself really is, I think, why most people are attracted to emotional intelligence, because they want to know how to handle conflicts with others better. Conflict is just part of life, right? It's going to happen. And conflict management is about facing those disagreements in a way that's really healthy and constructive. But through emotional intelligence means it's rooted in empathy as well. You know, Healthy, emotional, intelligent conflict has a lot of emotional regulation. So both parties are staying calm and they're staying grounded. Obviously, incorporates empathy, clear communication, and also a problem-solving mindset. A mindset that's like we can find solutions instead of putting blame on either party, right? It's really hard to have that type of conflict because oftentimes we're in the middle of conflict, still trying to handle the self-awareness and self-management stage. There are, let's see here real quick. There's, various techniques to think through problem solving or through conflict management. Obviously, focusing on your shared goals and values. What do you both want to achieve? Just doing intentional things to keep the focus on the solutions rather than the blaming aspect. I'm going to skip over some of the things I was going to add here because a lot of them are pretty intuitive. Stay calm, stay curious, not defensive. But you often have to stop and practice these things mentally. Like I said, when you're painting that bedroom and you're fighting with so-and-so from work, those conversations in your head need to be practiced in a way that practices de-escalation, that practices healthy conflict management. That's your practice field, is your own mind, essentially. Just because this is typically one of the most interesting or topics, or one of the topics that most people are looking to gain the most out of, I wanted to tie conflict management back through all 4 domains, because they all play a role in how conflict is handled, right? So with self-awareness, how does this help with conflict resolution? Well, you need to, or where does it show up, I guess, is you need to recognize your emotional triggers, right? Notice how your tone, your facial expressions, your body language might be unintentionally escalating things, because you are maybe responding physically or outwardly, but you don't have the emotion identified or managed. You're not even recognizing why you're being defensive right now. You're just in that fight stage, right? Self-management and conflict management is going to be that stay calm, that domain that allows you to stay calm, to pause, to breathe, to avoid feeling the conflict further. So you can see where self, whether it's awareness or management, plays a big role in how you're going to show up in this conflict, how you're going to contribute to its resolution or its escalation into further issues. With social awareness, draw into practicing on that empathy. You need it. The goal there, and this is really hard when you're in the middle of the conflict, is listen to understand the other person's perspective. To listen and not plan a response. That active listening we talked about. With the relationship management aspect, the goal isn't to win. You can communicate assertively, but also respectfully, and give and receive feedback as opposed to criticism, right? And you can repair trust. And it's just really complicated. I don't think I'm saying a lot of things that are really new, but I guess I'm using a framework and a common language we now have as a class for you to think through how these 4 domains show up in conflict, right? They all support conflict resolution, or can, depending on your skill level in these 4 domains, might contribute to why you're in so many conflicts, why the person you work with is so easy to be in conflict with, right? You'll have access to these PowerPoint slides, so it's fine, but there are some simple approaches, to conflict resolution and how to handle those conversations. But I would say a lot of these are absolutely things we're already teaching our children. It's just, again, we talk about the cognitive aspect of emotional intelligence. You have wired your brain to react in ways that you're going to have to train it to de-escalate. You're going to have to train it to think before you act. And I would hope nothing on this list is surprising to you, because you've heard it and you would tell it to a child. But it takes practice, and it takes literally a neurological rewiring. And for some of us, though, let's pause that idea, is it takes, a shift in values. Clifton's Strengths is the strength card called harmony. These people are peacemakers. They desire peace and agreement. I am not like that. I don't desire it. Sometimes I desire a little fight. That's a value shift in me I need to adjust, though, to be able to, I guess, avoid conflicts or prevent them or to de-escalate them. I have to place some value in the act of harmonizing with people. And if you remember back in self-awareness and self-management, knowing your own ethics and values, and where you stand on something plays a big role in emotional intelligence. So sometimes it's a neurological shift. Also, maybe sometimes it's more of a value shift. Conflict styles. I think we can do this. I think we can do this really quick. You guys had the opportunity to take a conflict styles assessment, and this is obviously going to help you, with the lay language. that will show you, whether you avoid or accommodate, compete, compromise, or collaborate, or problem solve with people during your conflict style. So knowing your default style kind of gives you a chance to practice more effective approaches. I'm just going to look at each of these real quick through the lens of like what its strength might be, but also what its challenge might be in conflict management, right? So if you were the avoiding conflict style, obviously this has its benefits. It's really good for cooling off tense situations, letting emotions settle, or walking away when the issue's, trivial. So there is something good about avoiding. I think that word has a lot of negative connotations to it, right? But you're good at, well, here's the downside. You're probably not good at circling back to the conflict. You're very good at building in a cool down phase, but you might lead to unresolved issues, simmering resentment because you don't want to go back to address the conflict, right? So you really, you need to, I guess the tip would be to step back when you need to step back, but you have to schedule a follow-up to address the important issue. This is my conflict style, I can tell you that. The accommodating conflict style, perfect for someone. These are people who maintain harmony and they show empathy. Obviously, this is going to strengthen the relationship because for this person, likely the goal is to walk out as closer with that person. Challenges. You probably have a tendency to neglect your own needs. Maybe there's some over accommodation and it's going to create some imbalance, which later creates resentment, right? There's something beautiful here, but again, when we're not using it in a healthy way, there's challenges with it. For those that are the competing conflict style, this is very an effective style when quick action is needed, or like when someone needs to stand firm on very critical principles. But obviously, downsides is that can escalate conflict very quickly. It can alienate others, maybe appear insensitive if it's too much, right? So this one needs combined with empathy. You've got to actively acknowledge other perspectives and build that into the conflict, to pull back the challenges this might impose on that moment. The compromising style, obviously, I love this because this really enables like quick, practical solutions where both parties give a little, but again, nothing's perfect. It may not really satisfy either person's core interests. Like the middle ground sometimes can be a shortcut, right? Then we've got the problem solving style, which is people who like to address, I don't know, find the win-win outcome, right? How do we fix the problem? Usually, though, this style requires a lot of like patience and a lot of emotional intelligence, and it may not be practical in urgent situations. So here's the thing, knowing these styles, little helpful, maybe give you a little insight. One thing that's even better is knowing the style of the person maybe you're in conflict with. So you have a better grasp of, what their go-to reaction is going to be in a conflict situation. And really, this is just one lens in which to try to view how your behavior, but you want to obviously couple this with what you've learned from the other assessments, what you've learned from your own experiences, right? We want to triangulate the things we've learned about you. But having a little assessment sometimes can give that information. We're not going to talk about this today. Actually, I have the slide to say that we'll talk about it next time. We've talked about 3 of the 7 skills. Obviously, the personality traits that you have, your behaviors, your thoughts, feelings, these natural reoccurring thoughts, feelings, and behaviors you have. That's the definition of personality trait. Some of them really have like a sweet spot in some of these areas. So as an example, woo, which is the Clifton strength thing. These are people who are very charming and outgoing and energetic. Like they literally are influence in a talent, right? This idea of developing others, the skill there. Well, there literally is Clifton strength called developer. Conflict management, people with harmony, their goal in conflict management is usually to resolve it in a way that there's peace again. That can aid in conflict management. So what I want to highlight here is that we're going to spend a little time next week, or I'll at least have handouts for you mapping those different personality assessments back to these skills to kind of show you where your home base, where your sweet spots might be. And I'm just giving examples here. This is obviously not an exhaustive list, but we do want to take time to map this stuff together. Because I think this is really where this is that next stage of awareness that I get really excited about. So okay, the journal. I think we're down to our last last one or two journals for the class. Prompt would obviously be to think about conflict. What communication habits do you have that help and hinder your relationships? So that's an optional prompt for those who don't know where to start with your journal this week. And I'm going to wrap up and stop there. And next week, we'll pick up with the other relationship management skills.